Welcome to Fast Keto. I'm your host, Ketogenic Girl. Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of Fast Keto. I'm thrilled to have Dr. Paul Mason joining us from Sydney, Australia, and I am so excited to have him on. He's doing some groundbreaking work on cholesterol and publishing a unified theory on cholesterol, and it's fascinating. If you have ever wondered about cholesterol, about fiber on a carnivore zero carb diet, and about salt intake, we dive into those three main topics today. And Dr. Mason is himself doing a zero carb diet at the moment, so I really got to pick his brain about the connection between gut health and doing a zero carb diet. But his theory on cholesterol is absolutely fascinating, and I think you're going to be seeing a lot more from Dr. Paul Mason coming very soon. So I hope you enjoy today's episode with Dr. Mason. A few disclaimers. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice, as I am not a qualified healthcare provider. The information presented on this podcast is for educational purposes only. Ketogenic Girl is not qualified to provide medical advice. Consult your own physician for any medical issues that you may be having. This entire disclaimer also applies to any guests or contributors to this podcast. Prior to beginning a ketogenic diet, you should undergo a full health screening with your physician to confirm that a keto diet is suitable for you and to rule out any conditions or contraindications that may pose risks or that are incompatible with a ketogenic diet. A keto diet may or may not be appropriate for you if you have any kind of health condition, whether known to you or unknown. So you must consult your physician to find this out. Anyone under the age of 18 should consult with their physician and their parents or legal guardian. Hi, Dr. Mason. Welcome to Fast Keto. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Oh, it's wonderful to be here, Vanessa. Thank you so much for having me.
It took us a little bit of negotiating with the time zone differences between Prague and Sydney, but we figured it out, and I really appreciate you recording this a little bit later in the evening time. We have so much valuable information, and we're going to get to some really pertinent topics today, including cholesterol, fiber, and busting fiber myths, and also sodium intake. And I was really excited today to talk to you about fiber because that's one of the questions that I get the most. And I recently did a carnivore trial and experiment, and fiber was the number one question that people just needed to ask on a daily basis. And I'm really intrigued by some of your work and presenting that you've done on that.
Yeah, well, that was actually something that came about a little bit serendipitously. I was writing a chapter for a textbook earlier this year, and I was writing the section on fiber. And I started going through the guidelines, and I started parroting out the guidelines. And then I realized, I thought, well, hang on, this is just guidelines. I haven't actually looked at the actual evidence. And after about half an hour of searching the literature, I realized the evidence just wasn't there. I mean, we've steadfastly held up fiber for, more than a generation as being almost this magical elixir for constipation and a variety of other ills. And simply when I went looking for the actual evidence that would prove that, it wasn't there.
Where do you think it comes from?
Well, there's a couple of, I guess, what we call face validity in science. So sometimes if something has face validity, that basically just means it sort of makes sense if you think about it. It might be logical in some parts, but it doesn't necessarily make it true. And I think one of the things that had face validity was the idea that fiber would actually hold on to moisture, and that moisture would then make stool softer and make it easier to pass. But the trouble is, fiber doesn't actually hold on to moisture. And even in the 1970s, there was definitive research where they demonstrated that fiber had no water-retaining properties at all in fecal matter. And it didn't, increasing the amount of fiber within stools had absolutely no impact on their moisture. So I think at that very first instance, it sort of falls down at the first hurdle. But unfortunately, for some reason, that research was either buried or wasn't widely disseminated, and the myth about cholesterol continued to grow.
That's really amazing. I love the analogy that you had in your video about the traffic jam.
Yeah, well, I mean, that was an interesting one. So when I went looking for the science, I said it wasn't there. So the ideal level of evidence would have been a randomized controlled trial. So unfortunately, no randomized controlled trials exist looking at fiber and the symptoms of constipation. And I probably should take a step back here because there are some studies that look at transit time and fecal bulk, but that's not what patients are concerned about. Patients are concerned about straining, about bleeding, about bloating, about things that actually make them feel
Right.
bad. And there's no studies done on those actual things, but there was an experimental design done. And the really interesting thing about this is that they had a no fiber group. That's zero fiber, where people would sort of have filtered broths and, absolutely no cereals or bread or anything like that. And in that group, the symptoms of constipation, and there were 6 of them in the study, they all went down to zero. That is, 0% of the people in the zero fiber arm had any of the symptoms of constipation. And when you think about it, that's quite logical because the traffic jam analogy is we use fiber often to bulk up the stool. But if you think of constipation being a problem with passing something through a small hole, then adding fiber to make that something bigger is no more logical than adding cars to try and clear a traffic jam. It's just going to make the problem worse.
It's very logical. I mean, I can see how both sides of it are logical to people, especially if the fiber is supposedly retaining water and, providing bulk. But at the same time, if, like you're saying, there's a traffic jam in there, then you don't want to be adding more cars.
No, yeah. And the interesting thing is that this experimental design is still the only experimental study that I've actually have come across on the symptoms of constipation. And sure, there's some studies out there that demonstrate that having fiber makes the stool mass increase, which I don't think that's necessarily a positive thing. And there's some studies that look at the transit time through the length of the gastrointestinal tract. But I still am yet to have a patient come to me and say, "Doctor, I've got a problem. The food I eat takes 28 hours to go through my gastrointestinal tract, and I'd really like it to take less than 24. People just don't know that. It's just not a symptom. What they complain about is bloating. They complain about pain. They complain about bleeding and having to strain to pass a motion. So I think they're the things that we should be studying.
Yeah, and I think that IBD and intestinal bowel disease and IBS and these things are at extremely high levels in the general population, that, more and more people are dealing with that and not finding solutions. And a lot of people don't even really talk about it because it's maybe uncomfortable or embarrassing for them to be dealing with those kinds of problems. For many years as adults, they probably talk about it with their doctor. But if they're not finding relief and they're just adding more and more fiber to the mix, it's really not going to make things any better.
Well, that's the ironic thing. The first bit of advice people often get when they have gastrointestinal issues is to add fiber to their diet. And in actual fact, the research indicates that often makes the problem worse.
Right.
And when you think about it, fiber is like malabsorption syndrome. So I'm sure most people have heard about somebody who's lactose intolerant. And what that means is that if you have the sugar lactose, which is actually made up of 2 sugar molecules joined together, and I understand you're studying biochemistry, so you'll be all across this, is that you've got glucose and lactose joined together.
Yes.
And that if you lack the enzyme to break those 2 sugars apart, you can't absorb it across your intestinal wall. So it travels right down to the end of your bowel, and then the bacteria will digest it for you. And in the process, as the bacteria digest it, they'll also produce gas. And that explains a lot of the bloating. And the sugars then can also attract some fluid. And that fluid can explain why you might have watery stools or diarrhea. And when you think about it, that's the definition of a malabsorption syndrome. Mm-hmm. The whole concept of fiber is that it doesn't get absorbed. It travels down through the gastrointestinal tract to the end, where it gets acted on by bacteria, and those bacteria, in the process of metabolizing it, they will produce gas. So the whole concept of fiber is actually, could almost be a clinical syndrome.
It is incredible. My husband's actually lactose intolerant, and the other night he came home and I said, I'm going to explain to you exactly what's happening in your body when you eat dairy and you don't have lactase. The galactose and glucose are separating, and I told him exactly what you just said, and he went, oh, well, that's interesting, because to actually understand the biochemical processes behind it is different than just being told, oh, well, you don't have lactase.
Exactly. I guess one of the advantages, though, if you're lactose intolerant, you can actually take the enzyme.
Right.
You can take lactase enzyme, and that will then allow you to absorb it, and then you won't be producing the gas later on in your bowel from the bacteria. The trouble with fiber, there's no such option.
Right.
If you have that fiber, I'm afraid you're going to be paying for it later.
Right. And so in your talk, you said that some of the myths you were kind of dispelling. The first one is fiber is not necessary for health in general, and that we believe that it is an essential part of our diet. An essential part of having a healthy diet is having fiber in it.
Yeah, so there's absolutely no science to that. There's been plenty of populations studied who are effectively on zero fiber diets, and their gastrointestinal function does not suffer.
Right. And then you were also mentioning, I think your second point was that there are some foods that cause bloating and discomfort that are low carb foods, or there's some that you found to cause more.
Oh yeah, so this was quite surprising for me when I first came across it, because a lot of people complain about constipation when they go on a low carbohydrate diet. In actual fact, so in my clinical practice, that's probably the second or third most common issue that people will have on a low carb diet. And when you have a look at it, a lot of the low carbohydrate foods are actually really, really quite high in fiber. And it's the staple foods which often get people. So if I just list out a few foods that are really high, a lot of your listeners will probably go, I have that. So you've got avocados, you've got cauliflower, you've got nuts, and you've got berries, psyllium. So they're sort of probably the really common ones. And then you've even got ones like strawberries or raw coconut or tomato skins or green beans or other seeds, so to round it out. But in actual fact, when people go on a low carbohydrate diet, their fiber intake often significantly increases. It doesn't reduce. And when people are aware of that and they can start to moderate their nut intake and maybe not have a whole avocado for breakfast and reduce the amount of cauliflower they have. And, we all know about the cauli rice, and you make your pizza base with cauliflower and your mashed potato or your cauli mash. So we often really overconsume these fibrous foods.
It's absolutely true. And, I find it really interesting personally because I initially found keto because I found, that I had gluten intolerance and I had major abdominal distress and inflammation and pain. And one of the things that you do when you go on keto is you look for what are the vegetables that are the highest in fiber, because, the whole net carb thing and just, wanting to offset your carb intake with the highest fiber intake possible. And so you end up with all the cruciferous vegetables, and we're also told that those are the best ones for the gut microbiome as well, that they provide the best, nutrients, or they provide the best fodder.
Yeah, that's right. And I mean, the whole science on the gut microbiome is another lecture in itself. And again, there's very, very little science to justify the comments people make about trying to support the gut microbiome. In essence, the gut microbiome is a reflection of what you eat, but it doesn't necessarily give it any health-giving qualities necessarily on its own. So we know that if you change your diet significantly, then within 24 hours, you can completely change the makeup of your gut microbiome. Because basically, your gut microbiome eats what you eat. And some of the bugs will proliferate more with certain macronutrients, and other bugs will prefer other nutrients. And because they're such rapidly proliferating creatures, the little bacteria, that, E. coli can have a half-life of only 20 minutes in terms of how long it takes to replicate, then within 24 hours, you can have a massive orders of magnitude change in some populations, some increasing their numbers and some being outcompeted, basically. And the problem that we have is that we assume that if you're eating a certain kind of diet, it might be the diet that's conferring the health benefits, but people will assume that it's a microbiome resulting from that diet which is actually causing the health benefits. Mm-hmm. And we know, for instance, that when you change somebody's diet, you can reduce their glycated hemoglobin, you can reduce their blood sugar, you can do all sorts of things that we can actually track with blood tests and different other markers. And yet people are assuming it's a gut microbiome that's conferring the health benefits. And it's really just mistaken the chicken for the egg.
That's really fascinating. And can you explain to us a little bit what glycation is?
So glycation is what actually happens when a sugar molecule attaches to a protein. So there's a couple of different ways it can happen. The one I really am interested in is what we call non-enzymatic. And non-enzymatic means it just happens. It doesn't need a chemical catalyst to trigger it. And that's most useful for if you're on a very high carbohydrate or even a regular carbohydrate diet. We know that carbohydrates are really just polymers of glucose molecules. So carbohydrates are made of the sugar glucose. So when you eat a carbohydrate, that gets digested, that finds its way into your bloodstream, and all that sugar can then attach to your red blood cells. And this is probably one of the most obvious examples of glycation. And the more blood sugar you have, the more of it will attach to your red blood cells. And that's where the blood test that we use called HbA1c comes in very useful, because that directly measures how many sugar molecules are attached to your red blood cells. And the higher that is, that means your average blood sugar is higher. And that's such a reliable test because it doesn't just measure the amount of blood sugar, but it measures it over a duration of time, and it gives you an average. And this is now one of the preferred tests we actually use to diagnose diabetes. And it's probably more accurate than a lot of the fasting blood sugars and things like that. It's certainly more accurate than. And this glycation, this whole process where you're attaching to proteins, it actually damages the proteins. And that's why in diabetes we have problems with heart disease, because it damages the lining of the blood vessels. So the blood vessels that go to the eye, they're damaged. So we know there's a huge problem with blindness in diabetes. It damages the blood vessels to the kidneys. So certainly in Australia, the most common cause of going on renal dialysis, having to be plugged into a machine for hours every day, is diabetes. It damages the blood vessels going to nerves. So some of your listeners may have heard of the term peripheral neuropathy, where diabetics lose the sensation in their feet, and that ends up leading to damage, and they get these horrible healing ulcers that often leads to amputation of their toes or even their whole lower leg. So this glycation is a pretty serious problem, and it all just comes around because glucose attaches to protein.
Hey guys, just taking a really quick break to talk about the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. If you're interested in doing a ketogenic diet for yourself, it's a great place to start. I teach you everything about how to follow a keto diet to get yourself into nutritional ketosis, and it includes 28 days of meal plans. It comes with weekly shopping lists, how to interpret results, how to test yourself, a complete guide to getting started on keto. If you've been keto for a while and you're just not getting the results that you want to in terms of your health or fat loss, or you are brand new to keto, the 28-day challenge is a great option because it also comes with my free coaching and support in our members Facebook group, and you can post any questions that you have about the meal plans, about keto, and I am there supporting you. We have an amazing community in our group. I like to call it the happiest place online because everybody in there is so excited about following keto, about having found something that really works well for them. And everyone in there is just so kind, caring, generous, and supportive. And it's a really fun place to be and hang out. So if you'd like more info on it, you can find it at ketogenicgirl.com. And it's the 28-day Ketogenic Girl Challenge. And now back to our interview. That's fascinating. And we were just chatting a little bit before we got started here on a new unified theory that you're working on. I'd love if you could tell us a little bit of sort of preview for us what's going to be released.
Well, this is something I've been studying for a while now, and this is actually looking at cholesterol. And for a long time, there's been, from time immemorial almost, as far as I've been involved in the low-carb field, people have argued about the significance of LDL cholesterol and HDL and particle numbers and small dents and all of this. And what I've actually come across in my readings is actually something related to glycation, which ties it all together very elegantly. So a lot of your listeners will have heard about small dense LDL being the bad LDL and the large fluffy LDL actually not being a problem. And some research which I came across that was done by a group of scientists at Nagoya University in Japan, they were actually able to demonstrate that when the sugar attaches to a protein on the LDL molecule, it actually makes that LDL molecule smaller. And it makes it small enough for it to be considered a small, dense particle. So when we're thinking about, good and bad LDL, we should actually be thinking of it in terms of whether it's got sugar attached to it, which is glycated, or whether it has no sugar attached to it. And it's the sugar attaching to the LDL particle that makes it atherogenic, which basically makes it harmful. So if you have an LDL particle with no sugar attached to it, it's very, very unlikely to cause you any harm. But as soon as you have sugar attaching to it, it means it can't function normally. And I think this is a point that Dave Feldman has raised very correctly, is that LDL serves a purpose. It carries cholesterol around the body and delivers it to cells that need it. It carries energy around the body and delivers in forms of triglyceride and delivers that to cells that need it. And at the end of its journey, when it's finished doing its delivery run, it gets taken back out of the circulation by the liver. And the liver needs to recognize there's this identifying molecule on the LDL particle called ApoB100, and the liver recognizes that. And the problem is that when the LDL particle gets glycated, this ApoB100 molecule is damaged. So the liver can't recognize it. So then you end up with this damaged molecule with nowhere to go. And that's why they begin to accumulate in the circulation. So you probably have heard about LDL particle numbers accumulating. Well, that's basically down to this ApoB100 molecule being damaged and it's got nowhere to go. And a long story short, if it can't be taken out of the circulation by the liver, well, it ends up through another pathway being lining the blood vessels and causing atherosclerosis.
Right, and that makes so much sense when you consider how tightly regulated of a system the body is and how if it wouldn't be able to recognize it, it wouldn't really be able to excrete it or know what to do with it.
Exactly. I mean, so this is the whole concept of homeostasis. And in actual fact, there's a couple of other really interesting things that go on to the back of that. So the way the liver recognizes this particle to take it out of circulation uses something called an LDL receptor, which is quite logical. So this receptor it's like an electronic swipe access, and you've got the swipe card on the LDL molecule and the electronic unit on the liver. And when you take a statin medication, this is interfering with the body's normal homeostatic response. And the response of the liver in response to the statin is to increase the number of these LDL receptors. And that's why your LDL cholesterol level falls when you take a statin medication, because this receptor number increases and it just pulls more of the LDL particles out of circulation. But that's not necessarily a good thing because you're removing healthy LDL cholesterol from the circulation. And that's healthy LDL cholesterol that actually serves an important physiological function.
Now that makes so much sense. And you're about to publish some of this information
Yes, so I'm working with a Professor Grant Schofield from New Zealand at the moment, and we're going to be trying to hopefully get this published in the mainstream medical literature, and hopefully will stimulate a whole new line of discussion and a whole new line of research around cholesterol and try and move on from these existing paradigms we've got, which simply don't work.
I think it's going to be so incredibly useful for people to understand cholesterol. I know a lot of doctors still find it to be somewhat nebulous just in terms of understanding, why our body's producing over 300 milligrams of it per day, because it is such a vital substance for the body. And yet, so many shifts happen when people go on low carb that kind of worry them about their cholesterol. So, what do you tell people, say an average person who comes up to you and says, well, I can't do low carb because my cholesterol will go up?
I think the take home message is that if you increase the saturated fat in the diet, sure, there's a very good chance it'll make your LDL cholesterol increase. And understand that when I use the term cholesterol there, I'm using it very loosely because that's incorrect use of the term. But it's actually sugar or carbohydrates in the diet that will make the LDL cholesterol go bad. So having a high LDL is not a problem as long as it's not been damaged by sugar. So in a nutshell, saturated fat makes it go high, but it's sugar that makes it go bad. And I think if there was one take-home message for my patients, if they walk away with that message, then I'm happy, because that means that they can then relax. And as long as they can understand the science, there's absolutely no increased risk of cardiovascular disease that's ever been demonstrated if you have a healthy LDL population. When it's damaged, when you have high particle numbers because it's glycated, that's a different story. But you have to understand that's sugar damage, and that's not because you've had too much saturated fat.
I think you explain it so elegantly, and it is really interesting to me that most of the hype and fear out there about elevated cholesterol is related back to cardiovascular risk. And there's so many surgeons out there who are coming out and speaking about this. And, I think your theory is going to be really helpful for a lot of people to help them understand how the carb and the sugar intake is really more of a factor than eating healthy fats.
Well, I sure hope so. And I mean, I watched a lecture from Ken Sakaris at a conference a couple of weeks back on the Gold Coast, and he presented some very compelling data showing how HbA1c, or glycation of the red blood cell, is actually a much better predictor of heart disease than almost any other metric. And that makes perfect sense because that process is happening in parallel with glycation of LDL. They're both driven by the same thing. They're both driven by sugar in the bloodstream. So, and I think it really just ties together a few loose ends. And if it makes people more comfortable about going on low carbohydrate diets and not afraid of increasing the saturated fat in their diet, then that can only be a good thing.
That's fantastic. Now, I want to put some links to the show notes for people to find that video, and I will when this episode comes out so that people can watch more of your information about it. But just quickly going back to fiber, I think we can cover a little bit more ground on that. And I'm really curious as to your opinion on this carnivore diet trend, because I think that there have been some really good things that have come out of it. For me, one of the big ones has been having people test higher levels of protein intake and not being as afraid of protein intake and having to overly moderate it, because protein is, of all the macronutrients, the most essential one for our bodies. It has the most essential amino acids and requirements that we need to get from our diet, along with essential fatty acids. But another thing that's come out of it that's been really interesting is people questioning fiber intake. And I know that when I did my carnivore trial, the biggest question that I got is people were like, well, how are you eliminating anything? How are you going to the bathroom? So I think that it's probably brought fiber more into the discussion.
Oh, absolutely. That's the thing that most people are aware of. And I've actually been talking to Sean Baker about that. He's quite a prominent carnivore as well. So, I mean, for me, though, that's just the start of the conversation. I mean, I think I don't know from your personal experience, but I've experimented with carnivore and certainly it's not been an issue. And in the study I alluded to earlier on bowel actions, interestingly, there was 41 people in the zero fiber group and every single one of them had exactly one bowel action per day every day. And this compared to the high fiber group, which was having one bowel action on average, and this is from memory, I think it was every 6.83 days. So basically one bowel action a week on a high fiber diet versus one bowel action a day on a low fiber diet or a zero fiber diet. So I really don't think there should be no concerns at all about a carnivore diet in terms of bowel action.
I think that, yeah, that is one of the biggest concerns that people have. And yet I've read stories from people, there was this one man who was in his mid 40s and he said, I was in the bathroom several times a day in terrible pain, discomfort. And I was sharing this with my husband going, can you imagine that people are living like this? And they, you don't realize it, but there are a lot of people that we know that have had IBD or IBS or those kinds of struggles. You don't realize the pain that they're dealing with every day. And this guy said, I went on a zero carb diet and I no longer have any of that. Like a lifetime of suffering and dealing with those kinds of issues gone. And yet, I don't think carnivore diet or zero carb or plant exclusion is for everyone, but I found it so fascinating that a lot of people who struggled with all those issues that you mentioned were having so much relief just from excluding, a lot of the vegetables.
Well, I think one of the things that explains that is something that we haven't really touched on today, and that comes back to what we call FODMAPs. Well, we actually have touched on it because lactose is an example of a FODMAP. So FODMAPs are basically carbohydrates that are often poorly absorbed, like lactose for whatever reason. And they actually go down to the distal end of the gastrointestinal tract. And we know the story by now. They get metabolized by bacteria. They draw fluid in. The bacteria produce gas. You have alternating diarrhea, maybe with a bit of constipation if you're having too much fiber. And you're very, very bloated. And a carnivore diet will effectively eliminate FODMAPs from the diet. And FODMAPs have been strongly associated with irritable bowel syndromes. And there's a lot of studies that demonstrate that eliminating a low FODMAP diet is beneficial in about 4 in 5 people with irritable bowel syndrome who try the diet. And again, this is a massive problem on low carb diets because a lot of the staples of low carb diets have a lot of FODMAPs in them. And again, there's some of our favorites. So cauliflower is probably a big one. Mushroom, onions are there, blackberries, watermelon. And a hidden one, they're not exactly carbohydrates, but the sugar alcohols, the artificial sweeteners. So things like maltitol and erythritol and sorbitol, they actually don't get absorbed into the body, and that's why they have 0 calories. But the bacteria can digest them. And when the bacteria digest them, that's when the problems happen. That's when they start producing gas. If they're incompletely digested, they'll draw fluid into the bowel, and you've got your symptoms of irritable bowel syndrome. And the carnivore diet doesn't have any of those.
Right, and you see so many people experiencing relief from that. I think maybe the flip side to it is a lot of people have relief from not having this insoluble fiber, this soluble fiber in their diet, but then they're killing off a lot of bad bacteria, but then are you also killing off your entire gut microbiome? And what's your opinion on how carnivore going zero carb would shift or affect your microbiome?
Well, it has to shift it. Definitely has to shift it. But it's probably better not to think of it in the way of killing something off, but in the way of nourishing a different population. So, and there's a definite shift. And in actual fact, when we have a look at the balance between two of the major classes of bacteria, the Bacteroidetes or the Firmicutes, the ketogenic diet has actually been shown to lead to a favourable balance between those two classes that is associated with weight loss. Now, again, that doesn't mean that those bacteria lead to weight loss. What it just means is that the ketogenic diet is probably what leads to weight loss, and that's associated with that type of bacteria. A lot of people are also concerned about the production of what we call short-chain fatty acids, because one of the byproducts of bacteria metabolizing fiber is actually these short-chain fatty acids. But interestingly, you can also produce short-chain fatty acids from the digestion of peptides. So peptides are like, they're proteins. They're some of the building blocks of proteins. They themselves are made up of amino acids. So then that turns into a peptide. You have enough peptides, we'll term that a protein. And if you have peptides going down to the colon which haven't been fully digested, and that's very common, then the bacteria that digest them will also produce short-chain fatty acids. And in actual fact, there's some data, and certainly in animal studies, that demonstrates that there can be a higher amount of short-chain fatty acids on a carnivore diet than there is on a plant-based diet. And that's, I think that really shines a spotlight on the often stated claim that vegetarian diets are better for the production of short-chain fatty acids. And that's even ignoring the science that suggests that short-chain fatty acids aren't necessarily essential good health, especially not in the bowel. And the reason for that is that when the cells that line the colon, they actually absorb the short-chain fatty acids and use them for energy. But in the process of using them for energy, they first convert them to ketones. And in that way, they're no more beneficial than somebody who's in nutritional ketosis, who has ketones circulating around their whole body. And in actual fact, it's arguable that somebody in nutritional ketosis is going to be supporting their bowel function even better, because the ketones have access to every single cell lining the gastrointestinal tract. Whereas if you're just getting short-chain fatty acids from fiber, then there's only a very limited portion of cells in which the fiber and the short-chain fatty acids are in direct contact with that will actually be able to derive that benefit. So I guess the 2 points there are, one, that short-chain fatty acids aren't necessarily that magical, and certainly they're probably no more beneficial than being in nutritional ketosis, probably less so. And number two, even if they were magical, well, you can have just as much and possibly even more on a meat-based diet.
Right, and there are so many, bioavailable nutrients in animal products and meat. You can see why people are also thriving by getting more of those bioavailable nutrients, especially iron, for all that oxidation. And it's very, very interesting to me. But I'm curious, knowing as much as you do about the gut and gut health, what do you think are some of the best strategies that people can implement to maximize their gut health and optimal gut lining?
Well, I mean, this is really interesting. So I think you start this conversation by coming back to gluten. And I'm not sure if you've ever talked about gluten or zonulin or leaky gut on your podcast before. I'm sure it's probably a topic that's come up.
Yeah, I definitely have spoken about it, and especially with some of the work that Paleo Medicina is doing with regards to zero carb diets, or just eating kind of a paleo ketogenic style diet for enhancing and improving gut lining.
Yeah, so I mean, enhancing and improving gut lining, there's so many things. I'll just try and tick a few off. So first of all, you need a good mucus layer. And there's actually some emulsifiers found in food that have actually been demonstrated to thin the mucus layer. And that's really not a good thing to do, because that basically means that the things that you're eating that are potentially problematic, just that little bit closer to getting across the lining of the intestines, and that's probably what we'd call leaky gut, if you have free passage of some of those things that are meant to be contained within the lumen of your gastrointestinal tract, escaping across. So from memory, polysorbate is one of the emulsifiers that's a problem. And I do want to make the point that lecithin, which is a commonly used emulsifier in food, does not have that effect. And in actual fact, that's actually got some unique properties in itself that makes it very useful, which I won't go into now, but certainly for polycystic ovarian syndrome and fatty liver and a few other things, lecithin is very, very useful. So first of all, you can thin the mucus with emulsifiers. That's not good. You can reduce the production of mucus, and that's if your colonocytes don't have enough energy. And it's been demonstrated that if you are in nutritional ketosis, then you supply more energy to the cells lining the colon, the colonocytes or the enterocytes, and that puts them in a better position to create a healthier layer of mucus. Then we come to something called gluten, which can influence the production of something called zonulin. And that's actually been shown to cause what we call leaky gut. So the cells that line the gut, they're held together at what we call tight junctions. And that means that things aren't meant to be able to pass between them. But if you have gluten, then through the action of zonulin, that leads to these tight junctions becoming less tight, and things can actually leak across. So I think just for a cook's tour, you probably should avoid certain emulsifiers. You should try and be in a state of nutritional ketosis to nourish the cells that line the gastrointestinal tract, and you probably should avoid gluten. And that's even if you're not celiac. There's actually been some data that has shown that leaky gut proportional to gluten intake, even in individuals who do not have celiac disease. That is, it's a dose-dependent effect. So they're probably 3 good ways to start looking after your gut health, in addition to what we've already mentioned with the FODMAPs and with the fiber.
Could you just tell our audience, listeners, just maybe a quick overview of FODMAPs in case they haven't heard of it before?
Yeah, so FODMAPs, it's actually a bit of a funny word. It stands for fermentable oligosaccharide, disaccharide, monosaccharide, and polyol. So the first bunch of those letters there, except for the last one, are all referring to carbohydrates or types of sugars. And the last one, polyols, stands for what we call the sugar alcohols, which what we mentioned before are the erythritol and the sorbitols and the malatols and those kind of things. And the idea is that if you have these substances are prone to not being absorbed very well in the body. And if you don't absorb it very well, they can travel down to the end of the gastrointestinal tract where they nourish the wrong kinds of bacteria, they lead to gas production, they lead to the drawing in of fluid into the stool and diarrhea. So if you, for whatever reason, lack the right enzymes or what we call the disaccharidases to absorb these FODMAPs, then the simple solution is to simply avoid them. And the data shows that over 80% of people, if they have irritable bowel symptoms, if they go on a low FODMAP diet, they'll get a significant improvement in their symptoms.
We'll be back in a moment, but I just want to take a moment to say something about collagen. I received a lot of questions from you guys about collagen ever since I started posting my Level Up lattes where I add collagen to coffee. The only real drawback to bone broth, where you get so much great collagen, it's one of the reasons that bone broth has become so popular in the last few years, is you get this great collagen from it, but it's a real hassle to make. Now, for any of you who don't know, collagen is a special protein that your body uses to repair itself, whether you're getting it to straighten out digestive problems, help your mood, soothe achy joints, repair and support your gut lining if you have leaky gut, or just get that glow back in your skin. Collagen is a huge piece of the puzzle. The problem is that most of us get very little of it from our diet unless we're making bone broth around the clock. Now, maybe you're using a collagen-based skin cream or you're adding collagen to your coffee like I do. That's better than getting none at all. But one of my biggest beliefs is that food beats supplements. The closer a nutrient is to nature, as you know, the easier it is for your body to break it down. That translates into superior healing. That's why I want to tell you about this bone broth from Kettle and Fire. They simmer grass-fed bones for 10 to 20 hours, extracting every drop of body-loving collagen straight from its most natural source. Their beef bone broth contains 20 grams of collagen per carton, and their chicken broth has 10. No wonder they have over 10,000 5-star reviews. The only real drawback, as I said, is making bone broth is a pain to make, but that's not going to be a problem for you because order from Kettle and Fire, they ship their broth straight to your door in specially sealed cartons. That way you can heat it up on your stove, sip it in your mug, or load up on collagen in 5 minutes or less. It's the next best thing to having a chef come in your house and cook it for you. Kettle and Fire has put together a very special offer for my listeners who want to experience the bone broth difference. You can go to kettleandfire.com. That's KETTLE and fire.com/ketogenic girl and use the code ketogenic girl in all caps for 15% off. The coupon code is automatically applied when you buy through this link, which I will put in the show notes. That's very interesting, and I know some people may not have heard of FODMAPs before, so that's awesome. Thank you. And I think there's one last topic we wanted to cover today, and that was sodium intake. And it's one of those things that's been controversial over the years, just like cholesterol. So I'd love to hear your take and some of your findings on salt.
Well, I mean, this is a political football. And I think it's really interesting to understand why the recommendations to reduce salt came in. And it has arisen because of our affinity to use things called surrogate markers. And in this case, the surrogate marker is blood pressure. And we assume that anything that lowers blood pressure must lower heart disease. And it's been shown that if you reduce your salt intake, then you can reduce your blood pressure. And it's therefore assumed that that reduction in blood pressure will lead to a reduction in death rate. But unfortunately, that's not the case. And it's made the story way too simple. And the data would suggest the reverse is true. So we're in a really, so I'm from Australia, and in September last year, the official dietary guidelines on salt intake were actually revoked for an individual. So what that means is that if you're an individual in Australia, there is no recommended upper limit of salt intake, which is absolutely fantastic, because it really means that we're able to give advice to our patients that's evidence-based and on salt and not be in breach of the dietary guidelines. But just to make it confusing, there's still a dietary guideline goal for the population. Now, while this doesn't apply to an individual, the guidelines suggest that we should be aiming across the population for an average salt intake of about 2,000 milligrams a day. And the justification for this is that they calculate that that would lead to an average blood pressure reduction of 2 millimeters of mercury, just 2 millimeters of mercury, which is so ridiculously small, I don't even know why they bothered to calculate it. But the problem is that when we actually have a look at the all-cause mortality data, we see that people who are having less than 4 grams of sodium a day, and I probably should be careful to not use the term salt and sodium interchangeably. So salt technically refers to sodium chloride, which by weight is represented by about 40% sodium, and sodium itself is the chemical which we're particularly interested in. So when we actually have a sodium intake of less than 4 grams a day, your chance of dying significantly increases. And that's actually has been shown time and time again in a lot of studies. And in actual fact, the best evidence we have of people after having a heart attack, this hasn't been done in an experimental study, and it really needs to be done, but studies that have prospectively looked at people who have reduced their salt intake suggest that you might actually increase your risk of dying after a heart attack. Now, I will make the caveat that this has not been an experimental design and it's not the strongest level of evidence, but certainly it's very suggestive, and the effect size was quite significant. They were actually looking at something like an 85% increased chance of dying in those individuals who were on sodium-restricted diets after having a heart attack. So that's absolutely something really significant. And the reason that this is particularly important to people on reduced carbohydrate diets is that when you lower your insulin levels, as you invariably do when you cut out carbohydrates, your body can't hold on to sodium as effectively. There's actually 4 channels within the kidneys that hold on to sodium that are all activated by insulin. And when you lower your insulin levels, you start passing a lot more sodium out into your urine. And so that's why people on ketogenic diets, if anything, they need to push their sodium intake up even more. And if they don't, they're liable to have something we call the keto flu. So this used to be called the Atkins flu way back in the day. And that was back then, I don't think they had as good an understanding of renal physiology to understand exactly what was going on. But we know that they felt dizzy when they stood up. We know that they had dry eyes and they had several other symptoms. And the reason for that's really clear, because sodium is actually what holds fluid in the blood vessels. And if you have too little sodium, then you simply can't hold enough fluid so that when you stand up quickly, all the blood runs away from your brain and you feel dizzy. So it's really important for people on ketogenic diets to make sure that they're having sufficient sodium intake.
And how do you suggest that people typically do that?
I simply say add salt to your meals to taste. Now, if you're, I liberally add salt to all of my meals, and I actually recommend iodinated salt because I like to support thyroid function. There is a increasing amount of people who are iodine deficient, so that sort of kills 2 birds with 1 stone. Other people, if they're already deficient, if you have symptoms of dizziness or dry eyes or excess muscle cramps or other things that could be considered to be related to sodium deficiency, then you'll often get a benefit if you put a teaspoon rather, of salt in a glass of water and just drink that. And if you feel better within the next 20 minutes or so, then you've got a really good idea that that was actually the problem, and you know to try and increase your sodium intake. Now, there's some foods that are particularly rich in sodium. So olives are good, dill pickles are good. So if you don't mind having those, anchovies are good. A lot of our preserved meats, especially if they're salt preserved, have a very nice amount of sodium in them. So you can either seek out those kind of sodium rich or salty foods, you can drink it, or you can just simply add it to your meals. And at the moment, I'm just very comfortable adding it liberally to my food.
It's amazing how so many of these recommendations that we've been given, surrounding fat and salt intake, are now being invalidated in many ways by research and studies and doctors like you who are speaking out about it. And I think one thing you mentioned, a good point there was the iodine in salt. And so that's not as present in sea salt, correct?
Look, ironically not, because you'd think a lot of iodine comes from the sea. And certainly if you have a look at England, it's the areas towards the seaside that actually have the highest level of iodine in their foods. But for some reason, a lot of salt from the sea is actually more pure. And the more popular one, the Himalayan sea salt or the pink Himalayan sea salt, really isn't actually, people think it's got a bit of magnesium in it and these other chemicals that make it particularly wonderful. But they're in such trace amounts, I seriously doubt whether it's actually doing anything more than the cheap home brand or Saxa brand salt would actually do for you.
Right. And so if you were to have pink Himalayan sea salt, you just want to make sure that you're also getting sort of regular table salt, as long as there are no contraindications for you with iodine.
Absolutely. I mean, and obviously if you had an overactive thyroid or something like that, you need to be careful. But in general, sea salt has less iodine than table salt, and the Himalayan sea salt probably has even less. It does tend to vary. I've actually looked at the nutritional composition of it from a couple of different packets, and it always seems to vary. There doesn't seem to be a lot of consistency between it, but it certainly doesn't compare with iodized table salt. Yeah, unless there's a very good reason, I would say there's no reason that you should be avoiding the regular table salt.
Great. Now, with all this amazing information and kind of new findings that you've been working on, if you could put one thing on a billboard for everyone to see, what would it say?
Wow, that's a deep question, Vanessa. I mean, there's so many things that spring to mind. I think the first one is don't be afraid of fat. Obviously, I'd probably get a PR company to try and get the messaging a little bit better there. The reason I say that is I think that's the number one problem that I see in patients who come into my clinic who are struggling. And there's still this aversion to fat that people have been indoctrinated with over many, many years. And if there was one thing I could reverse that would make people's journey on low-carb diets easier, or certainly the initiation of a low-carbohydrate diet, it would be to put their minds at ease about saturated fat.
Yeah, and I guess that kind of ties into your work on cholesterol.
Well, I mean, it absolutely does. It ties very much into that, but it also ties into the entering into nutritional ketosis, to being full, having sufficient satiety after a meal, to making sure that you're actually filling yourself up on something that doesn't give you a spike in insulin levels, and that will then reduce your intake of carbohydrates and these other things. So it really feeds into all facets of a reduced carbohydrate diet. And I see it all the time in particularly my female patients. And I think that's just because they're more health conscious and more health aware. And in the past, they've actually taken on the messaging from their other doctors. They've taken that messaging to heart. And when I tell them, actually, I'd like you to increase the saturated fat in your diet, there's this real cognitive dissonance. They say, hang on, I've had 12 other doctors in the past and 3 dietitians tell me that this is bad. I'm having trouble with my brain getting around this concept that fat might not be that bad after all. So that's a real stumbling block for a lot of people. So, yeah, I think that would be my billboard message.
I think that's a really great one. And I'm curious what kind of diet you follow yourself personally. I imagine it's somewhere on the low-carb spectrum.
Look, I've actually evolved. So I've been doing this for 8 years now. And I started out doing your traditional low carb. And when I say traditional low carb, I made all the mistakes that I'm sure a lot of people do without guidance. I had relied a lot on artificial sweeteners. I was still activating my mesolimbic pathway, so I was still eating out of habit. I was still eating to the clock. I didn't have enough salt. I ended up going for a lot of foods that caused me stomach problems. The high FODMAP ones, I had particular problems with artificial sweeteners, both from an addictive perspective and also from a stomach perspective, causing a lot of bloating and we'll just say tummy upsets. So, and over time, I sort of progressed. I got myself off the sweeteners. I managed to get myself having an adequate salt intake, and then I probably moved from a low carb diet to quite a strict ketogenic diet. And I was there for a long time. And more recently, I've just been, experimenting with removing some of the plant proteins that I consider could be causing other issues, and that's probably a conversation for another day. But there is some very good evidence that certain plant proteins trigger autoimmunity. And so that can be conditions like, we all know about celiac disease, but Hashimoto's thyrotoxicosis, or problems with the thyroid, or pernicious anemia, or otherwise commonly known as atrophic gastritis. So I'm probably on a more animal-based diet at the moment, with cheese and eggs and poultry and fish and meat, probably forming a bulk of my nutrient intake, and probably plant foods less.
And what plant foods, if there are any, do you sort of still maintain or emphasize, or do you think you still like to have in your diet, or maybe have more of in the future?
Well, at the moment, I'm I'm probably more tending carnivore right now, so I don't actually regularly have that, and it would probably be more incidental if I was to go and get an omelette and there might be some spinach there or some mushrooms on the side or something like that. But it would be incidental, and I'm not so idealistic about it that I'd say I absolutely can't have that, but I probably wouldn't cook those things myself, and I wouldn't go out of my way to source them. So it's probably more incidental stuff in small enough quantities that it tends to not affect affect my gastrointestinal tract personally. And for me personally, I have a relatively sensitive gastrointestinal tract, and a lot of people will have their thresholds will be set at a much higher level than mine. But for me personally, I've settled on quite a low level of intake of plant foods.
I find it so fascinating. I went on carnivore in the spring and summer, and I had such a dramatic difference in bloating and indigestion. And, I realized that, like we were talking about before, so much of my vegetable intake was the cruciferous vegetables. And what I've been doing occasionally now is just having sauerkraut. I'm not sure if you have that in Australia, but, you probably do. Fermented cabbage,
Yeah,
I find
we've
it.
got some cans of it in my cupboard right at the moment, actually.
Yeah, I think it's a great way to have some prebiotics in the diet, as opposed to having none. Because as much as I like so much that it has come out of the carnivore, trend and everything, we don't have a lot of long-term research or studies done on what the long-term impact is of total exclusion of any plant foods. And although I think that animal proteins are the most nutrient dense, I do wonder what it does to the gut microbiome. And I do have some concerns that if there are too many things excluded, that it will be very difficult to reincorporate those foods back in. And I find it really interesting that you're trying out, carnivore yourself for a while, and seeing that, you're maybe the third or fourth physician that I've spoken to, actually probably the fourth physician I've spoken to who's been, doing a zero carb diet for themselves, which I think is very interesting, because you don't do anything without researching it, and you don't do anything lightly.
No, well, I mean, I read a lot of literature, I read a lot of science, and I was quite comfortable embarking on that experiment. And I think the interesting thing was for me is that it's defined a new normal. So I didn't realize that I used to feel bloated until it's gone. And then what you realize is that what you've been putting up with your whole life is not actually normal. And that's an experience that a lot of my patients will describe almost word for word. They didn't realize that they were bloated. They didn't realize that they were fatigued or tired until they no longer were. And then it's almost like a light goes off. And you're like, wow, this is how it should be.
Yeah, I think, it goes back to the traffic jam situation analogy that you mentioned before. And, just jamming all of this indigestible, matter through the body, and then not putting any of that through it. It's very interesting, because meat especially is broken down by the body and utilized so readily. It's a big shift I think people experience, like you said, in going from what they're used to a new normal. And then, you realize, well, I don't want to feel bloated and uncomfortable all the time. But I'm doing it because I've been told that, I have to do this to have optimal health.
Yeah, well, it becomes a personal decision. And I mean, for me, it was a journey, and I'm still on that journey, but it's, 8 years in the making. So, I mean, I guess it's sort of, I've spoken to several people who have sort of come across a similar evolution to me. But I mean, if you had said to me 8 years ago, you know what, I'm going to put you on an animal produce diet, I would have thought, you're crazy. There's no way on God's green earth I'm going on that diet. And yet it's sort of something which, whether or not it'll last, I really don't know. But from the way I'm feeling, I'm pretty comfortable with it right now. And, I'll last. I'll keep on it for as long as it keeps working for me.
I guess I just, as we wrap up, I know we touched on this a little bit, but what are your theories of what happens and how the gut microbiome shifts when you exclude all plant matter?
Well, I think what happens is that the bacteria that relies on plant foods gets outcompeted by the bacteria that will be feasting on whatever probably peptides and those kind of things are now getting down to the distal end of your gastrointestinal tract.
Right.
Now, I suspect that maybe there might be a reduction in the overall volume because there's going to be less volume going down there, so the bacterial population will probably reduce. But in actual fact, I don't think that change in population is necessarily going to be deleterious. Now, there are some changes in population that we know are deleterious. And probably the best example I can use is something called trehalose, which is a manufactured sugar that actually reduces the freezing point, and it's actually used in frozen dairy, things like ice creams and things like that. And that was approved for use in the Australian food industry, I think in 2003. And since that period of time, there's been an increase in something we call endemic Clostridium difficile infections, producing something called pseudomembranous colitis. And this can actually be a life-threatening condition. It kills people. And what it is this particular bug in the colon actually has shown to have a particular affinity for this sugar trehalose. And it's the particular strain that's causing all the harm is the one that has a particular affinity for it. And this has been published earlier this year in Nature journal, so it's very reliable research. Pardon me. So we know that if you feed the bacteria, put the wrong thing into your colon, the bacteria that will particularly metabolize that will proliferate. And unfortunately, this trehalose sugar nourishes a particularly pathogenic bacteria. But going on a carnivore diet, which has actually been done for a lot longer, so there's whole tribes over in Africa, the Maasai. There's examples over the world of groups of people that historically do not eat plant foods. And in none of those has there been any examples of pathogenic bacteria being selected out for. So I don't think it's a problem so much as what bacteria are being outcompeted. I think the question should be, are you producing any pathogenic bacteria? And I think the balance of evidence at the moment is probably no, you're not.
That's fantastic. Well, I really appreciate your take on these fascinating topics, and I'm going to be posting links to your upcoming video on the unifying theory of cholesterol, which I think is going to be really fascinating and a really important contribution to the dialogue.
Oh, that's great, Vanessa. Look, it's been an absolute pleasure to chat, and you're doing some awesome work here getting the message out there. So, I mean, your podcast is hugely popular, and kudos. And you're doing it while studying biochemistry and living on the other side of the world. I mean, you're doing some really fun stuff yourself.
Thank you. I'm so glad and just blessed to be able to do this because I love it so much. And I think, when you're passionate about something, it just becomes such a joy in your life. So I'm really thankful that I get to do this and get to speak to fantastic people like yourself, doing this important work. So thank you so much for being here. And we'll definitely have to have you back on for round 2. I think there's a lot more we could talk about on a future episode as well with your ongoing work.
That would be my absolute honor. And I hope to one day catch up with you at a conference. I understand you're doing a conference very soon.
Yeah, just getting ready for Mallorca now, the Low Carb Universe, and I might run into you at some point, perhaps at Low Carb Vale or one of those conferences if you're over there. But I think, what's the next conference that you're doing? Is it Low Carb in Australia?
Oh, well, I'm doing one next weekend in Australia, but I'm actually going to the Carnivore Conference next year in Boulder, and then the one the day after in May in Denver. So actually not in May, that's in March.
Oh, fantastic.
So I'll hopefully have the pleasure of seeing you there.
Yeah, that'd be great. I didn't know about the Carnivore Conference. I'll have to look that up. Should be definitely a lot of interesting leading edge.
Oh, that's going to be a cracker. That's being put on by Amber O'Hearn.
Oh, Amber's great. I didn't know she was organizing that. I'll have to get in touch with her and find out more about it. My husband's family is from Colorado, so we're there quite a bit. And I love that it's such a hub of, low carb kind of conventions and just lifestyle. It's such a healthy state in the US.
I think it was the last state to actually have, it was in terms of the obesity epidemic, I think it was always trailing behind the other states.
It is, yeah. I think it's
I saw
one of the healthiest states in the US.
Which is my absolute pleasure, and thank you again. Doctors probably had a bit to do with that as well, Jeff Gerber.
Yeah. They are awesome. I love Dr. Gerber there has been doing really great stuff and featuring, really leading edge conversations and helping other doctors learn about it, which I think is going to be probably one of the most powerful things going forward, is just other physicians learning from each other, what's working for them with their patients, especially when there's such dramatic results, like you've seen for yourself in, fiber reduction. And having the studies to back it up too, so they can help more people.
And doctors are getting more and more open-minded. I'm actually getting approached by doctors every week now. And I mean, certainly it's not yet in the medical school curriculum, and I think that's going to be some time away, but it's really heartening to see the number of doctors who are prepared to expand their knowledge base after their training.
Oh, that's so exciting. Yeah, I mean, lifelong learning, if whatever field you're in is important, but especially as a physician, there's the more I study biochemistry, the more I learn how little we actually know, about some of these areas. We're still learning so much.
And I can tell you that you're probably learning far more biochemistry than I did in medical school. I mean, you're probably learning the real stuff.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I definitely find it to be the most interesting subject area. So that's what I've been focusing on. But yeah, that's interesting to see how the curriculum will shift for physicians in the coming decades too. And just with the internet, just such an acceleration and sharing of knowledge. And, I'm in Prague and you're in Sydney, Australia right now. And we're, having a conversation about these topics that wouldn't have even been possible 50 years ago. So it's pretty neat.
Well, the dissemination of information is so much more efficient than it used to be. Mm-hmm. So it's just, unfortunately, there's still competing voices.
Yeah.
And there's still some people being a little bit mischievous out there and planting misinformation. Mm-hmm. And I think that's going to go on for some time, but I think the tide will turn.
I agree. Well, thanks to work, like the work that you're doing and being outspoken about it. And we really appreciate that. So thank you so much for being here with us today and sharing all your valuable time and insights with us. All right, thank you so much for tuning in today, guys. I hope you enjoyed this episode with Dr. Mason. I found it absolutely fascinating, and I will be posting links to his work and website in the show notes if you want to check that out in further detail. I want to tell you about my brand new Phase 2 meal plans. If you have been stuck in a keto rut, you definitely want to check these out. I created them after working on them for the past several months with higher levels of protein intake, and it really helps change things up if you've hit a stall or you've been doing keto for a while and things are not moving along at the speed that you'd like them to. Be sure to check it out at ketogenicgirl.com. You can do an initial or normal round of the 20-day challenge and then start this, or you can just start the 20-day challenge with the new Phase 2 plans, and they come with membership in the support and guidance group as well. So you can check those out at ketogenicgirl.com. You can also check out my free ebook there as well, and I'll put a link to that in the show notes. So until next week, I hope you have a fat-fueled rest of your week. Thanks for joining us, and be sure to leave me a rating or review if you get a moment. It really makes a huge difference, and I absolutely love to read them. Thanks so much, guys. Bye for now.